You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Dern.
We're finally at the end of the 2023 season, and it's time for another episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I am your host, Kevin Dern. Please give me a follow on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can also follow the show at DolphinsTalk.com, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to your podcasts. Now, I am recording this on Monday night during the Buccaneers-Eagles game, and told myself it was going to be a good day. Today is my birthday. I turned 38 years old and had a great day. My wife and two daughters were excellent. We went out, had great lunch, had a nice dinner. They got me some cool Dolphins gear, nice Dolphins throwback t-shirt. It was a really nice day, especially to be off work all together, the four of us. It was a nice change from our normal Monday. And this year, the Dolphins did not play on my birthday, so they couldn't ruin the actual day. And I wasn't going to let their loss ruin my weekend. I kind of expected it going in, and it played out as such. Not necessarily in the fashion I would have liked, and if you couldn't tell, that cold front from Kansas City has crept east towards us, so I am a little bit under the weather, so I apologize for the sniffles and the voice. But felt like after a several-week hiatus, I think after Dallas was the last episode I released, I wanted to see how the team fared going into that gauntlet and through that gauntlet, and, 0-3 post-Dallas, post-Christmas Eve. Not the result we all hoped for, but sort of the result that I guess is to be expected at this point. And now with the Detroit Lions, and congratulations to them, Dan Campbell, always a favorite character of mine in the Dolphins history, and one of my oldest friends, I've known since third grade, is a diehard Detroit Lions fan. So I think he was 4. He's a year older than me. I think he was 4 or 5 when the Lions last won a playoff game. So Sean, wherever you are out there, congratulations, man. I know you're enjoying it. But with the Lions win, the Dolphins now own the longest playoff drought in the NFL, 23 years and counting. And as a Cincinnati Reds fan, I get to double dip because in the other major sports that play series in the playoffs, they are the franchise that has had the longest drought, which I believe goes back to 1995, the year after the strike. I remember them getting swept by the Braves in the NLCS. So, not a great time in the sports universe for myself, other than my beloved Dayton Flyers are now ranked 21st. If you have CBS Sports Network, tune into them tonight, which when you hear this is Tuesday, so tune in Tuesday night. They will be at home, and I've reminded you twice now on the podcast, Deron Holmes is a name to watch. He will be a first-round NBA pick next summer. Enjoy him tomorrow night if you can. The Flyers are really good this year, and it's been a fun thing to see, but I haven't really given them my whole focus because of the Dolphins season. But now that is finished, and for me, college basketball and Premier League soccer are kind of the next two sports. With the Reds, I will admit I'm a complete fair-weather fan, but they should have a fun year ahead with all the young talent that they have. So have some things to look forward to, but as I mentioned, I turned 38 years old on Monday as I record this, and I was a high school sophomore the last time the Miami Dolphins won a playoff game, the wild card game over the Indianapolis Colts, the Lamar Smith game, 23-17. And was talking to a friend of mine named Evan, who may have some appearances here on the show coming up in the next few months or so. Was talking to him and telling him it reminds me of the Jimmy Johnson, Dave Wanstead years, where Miami would have a really nice team and you felt like you were going to go far in the playoffs, and then that December swoon, the collapse would hit, and they'd either miss the playoffs or melt down early on. A couple times they made it to the divisional round and got shellacked. The year against Denver when it was 38-3 comes to mind. And it's just interesting to me that I don't remember which reporter asked this today in the Dolphins postseason media availability with Chris Greer and Mike McDaniel. I couldn't tell who it was based on the audio. But someone asked, now that the Lions' drought is over, what would you say to Dolphins fans to tell them that you're close? I think it was Safed, but I'm not for certain. And you could just see Chris Greer squirm in his chair. What does he feel like? What does Stephen Ross feel like now that, the Detroit Lions drought is over? You've got the longest drought in sports, or in the NFL. You've been the GM now for 8 seasons. You don't have a playoff win to your name. You don't have a division title to your name. The big trade that you did with Laramie Tunsil, he's in the second round of the playoffs now with a playoff win to his name. Your seat's probably feeling pretty warm, and I would imagine Mr. Ross probably isn't too pleased with how this year finished. And I tweeted several things out during the game just because it was such a poor showing. And I think what's worse is the moment was certainly too big for Tua. Just the weather, the defense that had already given him problems once in the regular season, just to shit down your own leg like that is bad. Let's face facts here. Miami were more competitive a year ago in the 2022 season with Skylar Thompson at quarterback in a playoff game than they were with Tua Tagovailoa. 34-31 at Buffalo, 26-7 at Kansas City with Thompson and Tagovailoa respectively. Even my dog Chloe, if you heard her in the background, is voicing her displeasure by walking around. It's pretty bad optics, and that narrative about beating good teams is going to hang around the Dolphins until next year when they actually do it. I think even what happened to Dallas this weekend will serve to discredit Miami's one win against a team with a winning record because of Dallas's struggles on the road, and then to get shellacked like they did as a 2 seed. It really hit me like a ton of bricks. That collapse against Tennessee in the final less than 3 minutes is the reason why Miami's had to go on the road and weren't hosting the Pittsburgh Steelers in a playoff game this past weekend. But then you look at the other chances squandered against Buffalo. You still could have won the division. You're going to have to do a full-on autopsy of this team this offseason to try and figure out what the path forward is going to be. And that was sort of the intent. I'm not going to go over each of the last 3 games. I'm going to pick parts from each of the last 3 games, though, and kind of do a mini autopsy and give my thoughts for how the 2023 season went. And I think next year there's certainly a lot of pressure on Chris Greer to deliver a roster that's capable of winning big games, of Mike McDaniel to improve certain areas and deficiencies in his job. Probably not the ones that 99% of you are thinking with play calling. And we'll go into that and why you're wrong if you're tabbing him for play calling, unless you're talking about third and short situations, then you're correct. But general play calling and how he managed some of those games was way more correct than most fans will ever realize. And certainly on numero uno, Tua Tagovailoa. It's going into year 5. It's beyond shit or get off the pot time. He's living on borrowed time because of the 5th-year option at this point. You've got to be better than that. Better than you were against Baltimore, Buffalo, and Kansas City. That dog shit cannot continue. But we'll dive into all of that. So the way we're going to break down this podcast, and this will be a lengthy one, a juicy one, kind of have a month's worth of thoughts to kind of get out. We'll do a quick whiskey segment tonight. We'll go into the team superlatives for the season. We'll break down the offense and kind of what went wrong in the losses. We'll break down the defense and what went wrong in those losses, and then we'll kind of take a look at some of my thoughts going forward, having listened to the Chris Greer and Mike McDaniel press conference. I know Chris Greer always speaks in generalities, but you can always tell when he's telling you the truth, even though he doesn't intend to, if you know what to look for, that is. A lot of people would ward you off from taking anything from these press conferences. It's just the opposite. He tells you the truth about what they want to do a lot more than you think. And then some inside information that I have, we'll just kind of put, kind of 6 big points together for what I see this offseason looking like and into the team next year. So this will be a meaty episode. Grab a drink, grab a snack, and just let my brain ramble on. So the whiskey segment, this was actually funny. My wife was talking about a bottle of really good scotch she got me. This was in Father's Day of 2020. So I've had this bottle since June of 2020. Haven't opened it. And one of my all-time favorite underrated movies is the movie Sideways with Paul Giamatti, who plays a character named Miles, who's a wine snob, and he takes his freshman roommate out to, wine country in Napa as a last hurrah, not even really a bachelor party because it's just the two of them. And he ends up, he has this one bottle of Pinot that he reveres and ends up having kind of a bad relationship, and his book deal falls through, and he sneaks the bottle of wine into a fast food restaurant and has it with a hamburger to kind of cheer himself up. And it was funny because Paul Giamatti won a Golden Globe and took it to In-N-Out and had it on the table next to him in a tux while he's eating a burger. I didn't quite have it in my heart to have the bottle of Lagavulin 12, which is what I said we would open when we win the division. Sitting here in my basement on a random Monday night and drinking that for my birthday. So I've already had this one on the podcast. It's Macallan 12 double cask. It's not an Isla Scotch. It's a Highland Scotch, but probably the best one I've had. You can look up the information about it. We'll take a sip here for, the 38 special trip around the sun. A very smooth scotch. The Lagavulin 12 will have to wait for another special occasion, and maybe we'll have to attach it to something that's related to the Dayton Flyers or Arsenal or the Reds or something my daughters or wife are able to achieve, because it just feels like we'd be waiting a long time for the Dolphins to hit one of these high water marks. The season superlatives, I'm going to run through these pretty quickly. Team MVP, Tyreek Hill. It seems pretty obvious, especially in light of how the season ended. I think he's more valuable to the team than most any other player. Offensive Player of the Year, Raheem Mostert, tied Christian McCaffrey for touchdowns. Offensive Rookie of the Year, by default, Devon Achane. Defensive Player of the Year, I ended up putting two guys here because there really isn't a Defensive Rookie of the Year option. So Christian Wilkins and Zach Sealer. Miami's run defense, yards per game, actually improved by about 7 whole yards per game, fewer allowed in 2023 than in 2022, which is odd because they were the 4th best run defense in 2022, giving up 104 yards a game. They were the 7th rated run defense in 2023, giving up 97 yards a game. And they had 19 sacks between the two of them. And I think the general fans' favorite cop-out for Christian Wilkins is, well, he disappears in big games. And that's such bullshit. Learn what you're actually fucking watching, because he's a damn good player. Just learn about this defense. Listen to my show. Listen to some of the guests that Travis Wingfield and Kyle Krabs have on, because if you don't, you're just running with narratives and you have no fucking idea what you're talking about. Most improved player from throughout the season was David Long Jr. I think kind of by default, but he ended up with the highest grade in the league for any front 7 run defender at 93.3. That's why a lot of people were so high on him when Miami first signed him. I think you need to start working on an extension with him now, because he is under contract for next year, but that's it. And you've got him at a bargain basement price right now, and he proved he could stay healthy. Lock that dude up. He is a perfect fit for this defense. Most disappointing season for me would be Kader Kohou, although I've said this on my show, I said it on other shows. If you had him playing outside corner, it wasn't going to be pretty. That held true. And then there were several, we'll just call them business decisions he made the past couple weeks of the season where it's like, that's not the normal Kader Kohou. I think had kind of a up and down second year in the league. Most underrated player for me is Durham Smythe. I think it would surprise a lot of people, but he was actually 3rd on the team in catches and yards this year behind Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. And he's been a pretty solid blocker for the most part. So now we're going to dive into the meat of the show. The offense. We'll just start with Mike McDaniel. The past 2 games, I think a lot of fans would call the play calling kind of curious or game planning issues. But that's, if you really watch, that's more due to the limitations that Tua Tagovailoa has. And we're talking limitations on arm strength, which we all know that. That's pretty well laid out there, if you're not being intentionally obtuse about it. It's due to his situational awareness. I think it's fair to say his pocket management is not where it needs to be. Like if you watch the other games on Wild Card Weekend, what CJ Stroud did was a complete masterclass compared to what Tua Tagovailoa does in the pocket. Jordan Love, better pocket awareness and pocket management than Tua Tagovailoa. These guys are first-year starters, one of whom is a rookie, playing behind a pretty bad line outside of Laramie Tunsil. That's pretty damning for Oos, number one. You look at the Bills game in particular, going back to Week 18. In the first half, the Bills played their safeties in a 2-high structure. Miami ran the ball for like 103 yards. Achane went off. Second half, what do the Bills do? Well, they start rotating a safety down to whichever strong side of the formation is, and they start clouding Tyreek Hill. because you don't have Jalen Waddle in that game, based on how Buffalo is playing in the box, that formation that they're running tells you as an offense, as a coach, as a coordinator, pass the ball. You've got weak side options open for days. The problem is the weak side receiver you have in that game is not Jalen Waddle. It's River Craycraft, it's Chase Claypool, it's Cedric Wilson, it's Braxton Berrios, it's Robbie Chosen. None of those 5 guys were worth a shit in that game. I don't necessarily think you can fault some of the play calls, maybe a couple here and there, but the execution leaves a lot to be desired. Those guys can't win off the line. Tua was not able to execute in getting the throws out, and as such, you left your defense on the field to rot. You give up a special teams touchdown, and then, Miami actually called a pretty good drive and got down there, and you have, Chase Claypool runs a poor route, Tua makes a poor decision, on top of it throws a poor ball. 3 bad things on one play usually mean great things for the opponent. They got a turnover, Miami loses the division. Blows a 3-game lead. That shit is inexcusable. As soon as that happened, I was basically penciling in the Dolphins for a loss. And I've penciled them in for a loss on the road in the playoffs since I was on the Finside the NFL show during the bye week. These flaws have been obvious for months now, and they got exposed in the last 3 weeks. You look at what the Bills did. They played cover 1, they played cover 3. They basically built themselves a 4-4 structure, not using linebacker personnel, using some nickels, but basically played it so you had an 8-man box. If you're a quarterback that's worth his salt, and if you've got the ability to kind of elevate the rest of the roster around you, you feast on that. Dan Marino eviscerates that. Rodgers, Mahomes, C.J. Stroud, Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, Joe Montana, Jordan Love, Matt Stafford, Jared Goff. Tua and the Dolphins couldn't figure it out. Kansas City, we saw Tua's inability to read post-snap safety shifts exploited again. Safety rotations have been a problem for Tua since before Mike McDaniel even got here. You go back to the 2021 season, that Monday night game against New Orleans. Pretty bad game for Mr. Tagovailoa, and then Tennessee just ate his lunch the next week with what they did. Kansas City kind of did the same thing, where Steve Spagnuolo would start in too high. They'd rotate into a single high with a robber look, and then they would rotate after the snap back to too high. The interception that Tua threw in the first quarter, look at what they do with the safeties. They're basically flipping the safeties, the right safety and the left safety, but instead of doing it horizontally side to side, they do it vertically. And it's just something that Tua has not been able to figure out. So McDaniel knows it's a limitation. You have the cold and the wind. You can't throw much downhill or downfield because Kansas City's playing quarters and man and pressing you. Your offensive line, other than Teron Armstead, can't pass block very well on that night. You try to execute some of these screens, and Tua can't even get the ball out with enough pace to have the screen work and timing. The one that he threw into the ground against Devon Achane, or trying to throw to Devon Achane early in the game, if you hit him in the hands, that's a touchdown. There is nothing but green grass. So I know the Dolphins fan base loves Tua Tagovailoa. The Kansas City game, you put that one right up there as the worst game of his career in a Dolphins uniform. And I think that's the part that kind of just bitches everything up for the Dolphins this offseason the most, is when you needed him the most, he laid an absolute egg in that game. Well, that being said, where I think Mike McDaniel can grow is game flow management. You look at his play calling operation. You look at the situational awareness, knowing when to challenge, when not to, which, by the way, those are actually called in from a spotter the Dolphins employ up in the booth. Not by McDaniel himself, but they've got to get that operation figured out. That was one thing, no matter who the head coach was. Darren Rizzi was the guy that the Dolphins tabbed to do that. Rizzi was always pretty good at knowing when and when not to challenge. Obviously, he's no longer on staff. You look at the lack of discipline, looking at the penalties. You think back to the Philadelphia game. You literally have a delay of game off the opening kickoff. You have to burn a timeout after a commercial break. These things are so obvious that Miami just can't seem to get right. You look at the procedural penalties that they have because of all the shifts in the motions. I'll grant you that you had to add some personnel to the roster middle of the year with guys like Claypool and then Robbie Chosen going up and down, but that kind of stuff is stuff you need to work on more within the week. And I know McDaniel is very deliberate. I would tend to doubt, just based on some information I have, that let's give you a versus situation. I tend to doubt they would drill that stuff as much under McDaniel as they would back when Brian Flores was the head coach. The proof's in the pudding in terms of penalties. McDaniel's very deliberate, and I think that is one of the reasons why players love him and like to play for him, is he gets them off the practice field without wasting their time. But the devil's in the details, and the Dolphins aren't very good at the simple stuff quite a lot, and it's especially apparent on the road. That's something they've got to get better at. As far as play calling, if you want to grill him on the 3rd and 1, 3rd and short situations, absolutely. Something has got to be done there. But I don't think you need to take away his play calling duties. Miami was leading the league in yards per play, in scoring per drive, total scoring, total offense for most of the year. I think they finished second in scoring offense at the very end behind Dallas. But it's the stupid penalties, the having to take a timeout after a change of possession or an injury or a TV timeout, the order of operations stuff, let's call it, the stuff that happens before the play, before you even break the huddle, has got to change. And you go back and you look at the losses to Philly and Kansas City when the offense was just inept for most of the game. It's all pretty apparent there. So those are the things that you have to acknowledge, and I will at least take comfort that McDaniel did acknowledge those things directly. He was asked about the penalties today in his post-season press conference, and he addressed those. I think he's well aware of what needs to improve. I think it's more the mechanism of how they get it improved is what really needs fixed. With Tua Tagovailoa, as we move on, we'll kind of go through each position. And as I said, this will be a long episode. At this point, he's due $23.1 million for his fifth-year option. You can't really get out of that now. You've already put that on the books. To me, that's the biggest conundrum of the season. What do you do? And it comes back to what Chris Grier said today. The plan is to have him in Miami long-term and playing well. To me, that sounds like they were talking about a contract at one point, which Chris Grier basically inferred to us. And I think now it's more they're going to wait and see. If Tua is willing to take a less than market deal, maybe it gets done. If Tua and his agency, Athletes First, which those guys are the guys that are behind the Dak Prescott contract, the Deshaun Watson contract. Oh, by the way, they've got several other high-profile clients on the Dolphins that need paid. Christian Wilkins, Deshaun Elliott, both free agents this year. They also have David Long and Javon Holland and Jalen Ramsey. You can't piss them off with these Tua negotiations. You've got to handle this very, very tactfully, very diplomatically. And I hope that's something that is Brandon Shore's strong suit, because I don't get the sense that Chris Grier can play that type of ball. And I think what makes it hard with Tua is we've actually seen him carve up good defenses. In 2021, the Carolina Panthers had the top-ranked pass defense. Came in, Tua sliced them up. They played Chicago last year in 2022, a fifth-ranked pass defense, sliced them up. We've seen that he can do it, but it's not always that level of play. It's not always that consistent. And I think what really stood out to me in that Kansas City game is his situational awareness, like knowing how much time is left on the play clock, knowing how to get guys set up quickly, knowing how to get out of the huddle quickly enough. It was downright abysmal in that game. And it's been that way on the road most of the year. You look at Philadelphia, you look at the Kansas City game in Germany. The Baltimore game, it wasn't bad, but you were getting shellacked so much anyway, it kind of didn't matter. And then Kansas City in the playoffs was just especially terrible. Everything about that performance. I used to think you wouldn't see Tua play a game worse than that Tennessee game in 2021. The playoff game was worse. Maybe not statistically, but yikes. It was all kinds of bad. And the 2-minute offense they tried to run late in that was bullshit. High school offenses can run a 2-minute drill faster than what Miami did. I'm not being hyperbolic here. It was so bad. That was Jared Goff Rams bad when Sean McVay had to tell him everything to do in his helmet before the play would go. Tua's not that bad, but he ain't that far out of the neighborhood. And like I said, we're going into year 5. How much more is there for him to grow until he's a finished product? And that was kind of what Mike McDaniel said. I hope it's exponential growth. I think even deep down, Mike McDaniel kind of knows, we've kind of seen the ceiling at times with Tua. We can't always get him to play at the ceiling, which I think is kind of true of all quarterbacks. But the deviations from your good games, your really good games, your great games, those are all kind of in the same realm for the great quarterbacks, the Mahomes, the Joe Burrows, unless he's playing the Browns. Guys like that. The lows for Tua are just fucking falling off of a cliff bad. And that's the problem. If you're a student in school and you're getting A's for the most part and a B- at worst, that's great. You're going to end up on the honor roll. Tua's that kid who bombs the midterm with an F, and now he's got to fight to get his grade back to a B or whatever. You can't have that. And one analogy I came up with talking to a friend is he's like a sniper. He's very accurate. He can be very good tactically, operationally, when the conditions are right. But when the conditions are wrong and, something you're trying to do isn't working, as a quarterback, whether you like it or not, you can't be just the sniper. You've got to be the commander in the field. And Tua really, really struggles with that on the road. And it's not particularly close. Watch any road game this year. Watch how many problems they have with pre-snap penalties, getting people aligned, getting out of the huddle quickly. Watch his pocket management, especially the games that Connor Williams missed. Buffalo, Philly, late in the year with Baltimore, Buffalo, and Kansas City. and that's kind of a smoking gun we'll talk about in a little bit. I'm sorry, but you can't pay that guy $250 million. You can't pay him $40 million a year to not be good enough in those situations. I'm not saying he has to be like Peyton Manning and figure out the entire defense before you even snap the ball. I'm not saying he has to be Dan Marino and being able to put it wherever he wants. Just be better than what you're at. And I think that's what's most alarming to me, is that part of it just seemed to get worse throughout the year in the road games. And I don't know if that's him being skittish and afraid to take hits because his footwork, especially after the bye week, road and home, got really wonky, and that's happened 2 years in a row now. Like, it's just these weird little quirks with him. It just leaves me feeling unsettled. And I went back and looked at every loss, because Tua was the quarterback in every loss. These are the overall statistics. So this is everything compiled from the Bills game, Eagles, Chiefs, Titans, Ravens, Bills, and Chiefs again. He was 151 of 238 passing. That's 63.4% completion percentage. 1,540 yards, which amounts to 220 yards a game. 7 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. And he was sacked 18 times. So if you put that all together, you're completing 63% of your passes for 220 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. You're getting sacked 2.6 times a game. That's not good enough. And I think what's worse, we talked about the maneuverability in the pocket as the year wore on. Look what C.J. Stroud just did. The Cleveland Browns were the number 1 defense in the NFL and just shredded them. Like, you can't win with a quarterback who puts himself into and then plays in quicksand. And that's what Tua was doing. Like, he's afraid to sidestep and step up. And Mike McDaniel mentioned that in his presser today. And I'm sorry, but we're going into year 5. That shouldn't be something you have to focus on with your starting quarterback, especially one who, has aspirations of being a franchise guy and you're paying him that much money. There's a disconnect here. And then you look at the bye week, the post-bye reversions the last 2 years. Think about San Francisco and the Chargers game in 2022. Think about the losses we had at the end of the year. That can't happen. You can't crumble when things don't go to plan. You can't play off script. Take a look at some of the film breakdowns that Connor Orr and Dan Pizzuta did in their articles kind of dissecting Tua for Sports Illustrated and the 33rd Team, respectively. Look at their EPA per play, which is an efficiency rating. Look at him each of the last 2 years. So in 2022, it went from 0.40, which is phenomenal, in October to minus 0.28 by the end of the year. This year, it was at 0.59 in September and October, which is astronomically good, and went down to negative 0.10 in December, and he got it back to 0.10 by the end of the season through the wildcard game. That's a wild decline, and frankly, it's not good enough. You have to be able to keep some sort of level there. Now, I think some of that plays into the offensive line. You look at, I don't know how valuable the metric is, but ESPN has the Dolphins at 31st in the league in pass block win rate. And I think if you really boil it down, Teron Armstead's the only guy who can actually sustain pass blocks one-on-one for a long enough time to set up, every kind of throw you would see any kind of NFL quarterback make. He's by far and away the best pass protector, and sounds like he still wants to play, which, he played 11 of the 18 games this year, more than some people thought. Had a freak injury in training camp. But he can do things on an island that the other offensive tackles can't do, including Austin Jackson, who just got an extension. But Teron Armstead, he's got the body of someone who's been in the league 11 years. He's got the body of someone who's going to turn 33 before training camp starts this summer. And the rest of the O-line was pretty bad in pass pro when Tua couldn't get the ball out in less than 2.5 seconds. That includes Rob Hunt and Austin Jackson. And, we talked about the Connor Williams injury. That's a bit of a smoking gun because you look at the points per game with him versus without him. Look at the opponents Miami played without Connor Williams. He missed the Buffalo game, missed the Philly game. He missed the Dallas game, missed the Ravens game, the second Bills game, the second Chiefs game. You probably weren't scoring that many points as you normally would anyway against those 6 teams. It's not that much of a difference. It's just frustrating and, kind of looking at it. I was kind of told before Connor Williams' injury that they were going to target re-signing him before Robert Hunt. And then the Austin Jackson thing happened. And then Connor Williams got hurt. I think now Miami, one interesting thing to study would be the LA Rams and how they altered their run game to have more of a gap scheme approach this year. I've basically reading some tea leaves from Chris Greer's presser today and some other things I've been past. I think Miami would now reverse it and prioritize Robert Hunt, if they can, over Connor Williams because they want to get a little bit bigger, a little bit more physical, and you're going to have to basically look at left guard, center, potentially left tackle, and I think they want some continuity on Tua's blind side with Hunt and Jackson. At wide receiver, Tyreek Hill, superb, but he had some big drops in some of the big games. Those were a factor. Jalen Waddle had probably the quietest 72-catch, 1,000-yard season you've ever seen, but was battling a rib injury through camp and had some other injuries throughout the year. I expect him to have a nice bounce-back season, and 3 straight 1,000-yard seasons is pretty incredible, considering some of the circumstances that he came into with the Dolphins. The problem with the receiver is really everyone else in the room. I contend Eric Ezukama would have been a nice weapon to have, and I think he would have been pretty good in that Trent Sherfield role. But, you have a neck injury, and now, it's questionable whether he's able to continue playing at all. Braxton Berrios, I know a lot of people were very high when they made this signing. I think he merits re-signing, but as a return specialist, you shouldn't count on him being a slot receiver in this system. If you want the reason why everyone saw the L'Jarius Sneed jam on Tyreek Hill from the game on Saturday, watch what happens to Braxton Berrios anytime he gets pressed. He won't be involved in the play. He cannot beat it. He cannot. You look at Cedric Wilson was essentially on a mercenary deal because of how they restructured his contract. You can basically cut him to save cap. He's probably gone. And that's how you end up with Durham Smythe as your third leading receiver in terms of catches and yards, 35 for 366. The rest of it, listen to these numbers. Cedric Wilson, 22 for 296 and 3 touchdowns. I think you're paying him $12 million a year. Braxton Berrios had 27 for 238 and 1 touchdown. River Craycraft, 9 for 121, 1 touchdown. Robbie Chosen, 4 for 126, 1 touchdown. And that was in the Panthers, or the Broncos game when it was way out of hand. Or Panthers game, one of the two. Chase Claypool, 4 for 26. Julian Hill, 6 for 48. That isn't good enough. And all those guys, aside from Julian Hill, are free agents. You've got to find a third option that's better than this. And, Durham Smythe, for as solid as he is, and I think as underrated as he is as a pass catcher, he shouldn't be that third guy. Miami, in my opinion, needs someone with size and running ability. They had that with Sherfield. I think they could have had it, and maybe they still will with Eric Ezukama, depending on his health situation. But you've got to hedge your bet there, and you've got to build out the rest of that room a little better than what you had. I left out the running backs because I think you're pretty well stocked for next year. Mostert, Wilson, Achane are all under contract. Chris Brooks is an undrafted guy. You can easily put the ERFA tag on him. You can probably even move off of Jeff Wilson and run with a trio or add someone. I'm not worried about that room. You go to the defense, and I think the story here is you're pretty much ravaged by injuries the entire year. By my count, you only had 3 games, which I think were the New England game at home, the Kansas City game, and then the Raiders game after the bye, where you had all 11 of your projected starters. I take that back. Javon Holland, Deshaun Elliott missed one of those games, and Brandon Jones had to play. So really only had to, it was the Patriots game, so you had to have 2 games where you had all 11 of your projected guys on the field. So that's rough. Ramsey return through the Black Friday game, that was kind of that time period. You had a bye sandwiched in there. With the Kansas City game this past weekend, I know people are talking about Fangio turning into Josh Boyer. That's not the case. That's just playing the cards you got dealt. He chose to live in a high variance mode where you're blitzing a ton because you're giving yourself the chance to make some plays and get some hits on Patrick Mahomes, because you can't rush the passer with the combination of Melvin Ingram, Emmanuel Ogbah, Malik Reed, Justin Houston, and Bruce Irvin. You weren't going to make it happen. And I think with Fangio, and then without Jerome Baker, without Javon Holland, without Xavier Howard, Fangio in that circumstance is just simply putting the Dolphins in the best position to win based on what he has and who he's going against. I highly doubt you would see another game plan like that from him had you had more pieces involved. But that doesn't absolve Vic Fangio entirely. You had 2 games this season where he got thoroughly out-game planned. The Buffalo game on the road in Week 4 and the Ravens game in Week 17. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You had bad plans. You had bad use of personnel. I would argue the Philly game, you had bad use of personnel by trying to put Kader Kohu on A.J. Brown. Why you didn't develop Cam Smith more, especially after the camp he had, that's an unsolved mystery that needs investigated, because Cam Smith, I would contend, was probably better than both Kader Kohu and Eli Apple as a perimeter corner. You had the Andrew Van Ginkel experiment, which he admitted, he tried to prove it watching film. He only found 6 snaps of Andrew Van Ginkel ever playing off-ball linebacker going back through his tape at the University of South Dakota. He just did it out of a gut feeling, and it was an abject disaster. Fortunately for Van Ginkel, injuries, which were unfortunate for Miami, forced him to play on the edge, and he had a great year. And he's, barring the injury situation, is probably going to get a nice payday from somebody else. I think Miami would be conducting bad business to bring him back. But you've got to address that position. When you look at overall, I think despite all the injuries, despite having a complicated scheme, despite the offense and special teams bullshit about being a good complementary football team, because sometimes they're not, it wasn't a bad year. You finished 10th in total defense, 7th in run defense, 15th in passing defense, 22nd in points allowed. But if you adjust that for the 57 points, that's 5-7, 57, Hines 57, 57 points that are attributable to offense and special teams, that takes Miami's number of points allowed from 23 a game down to 19.6 a game, which takes you from being ranked 22nd to being ranked 10th. And that's despite giving up 56 and 48 in 2 games this year. So I think as we get into year 2, and if you're able to bring back Christian Wilkins, find a running mate to go with David Long, and let's call the obvious one out, figure out who you're going to replace Xavier Howard with, I would expect another big jump for the defense this coming season in 2024. When you look at the defensive line, like let's call it the front four, Chubb, Sealer, Wilkins, Phillips, plus Van Ginkel being in there, they were carrying the team mostly after the bye. And you lose Phillips on Black Friday, you lost Chubb in the Ravens game, you lost Van Ginkel against Buffalo. You know, it's like trying to drive a car with one tire. Like, it ain't working. You've got to account for these guys, especially Chubb and Phillips, because they're both under contract, probably not going to be there for the start of the season. So you've got to at least make some kind of addition for depth that can at least be salvageable. You know, maybe Andrew Van Ginkel comes back on a 1-year prove-it deal again or something. Maybe you can develop Quentin Bell and Cameron Good a little more. But you've got to account for that now in your offseason plan, and that probably wasn't as towards the forefront as it's going to be now because of those injuries. You're going to have depth that will play. You need to figure out defensive tackle depth. Now, I've kind of been given the info that it's likely something gets done with Christian Wilkins to where he's a Dolphin again in 2024. What I do not know is that a franchise tag? Is that like a quick 2-year deal where it's basically they give him 1 more year and then there's an out? Or is it like a 4 or 5 year deal? You know, Christian Wilkins, I think, will turn 28 next year, but he's only missed 1 game in his career, and I believe that was a game he had to serve a suspension for as a rookie. He's extremely durable. He's extremely productive. I predicted he would have at least 7 sacks in this Fangio system, and he had, 9.5? You had 19 sacks between he and Zach Sealer, being top 7 in run defense. If you can find a better running mate to go with David Long, I think that number gets even better. So much hinges off what you're able to do in this Fangio system with your defensive tackles and being able to play light boxes. I think it would be a grievous error to let Christian Wilkins walk away. About the only solution that's ready-made out there where you could bring in a player and not have much drop-off at the beginning, like Derek Brown from Carolina. But if you're going to pay that much for Derek Brown, you might as well just pay Christian Wilkins. I mean, the man is, outside of Tua, is the leader of the team. Pay the man. Keep salt and pepper together. And you've got to figure out some depth there so you can keep those guys more fresh as the year goes on. Off-ball linebacker, putting Andrew Van Ginkel there, we talked about that. Jerome Baker was fine. I thought he had his best year since 2020. But is that worth like the $13 million a year you were paying him? No. David Long was a revelation, tremendous run player, got better as the year went on in passing situations, had a 93.3 run grade from PFF, which is massive. He's an animal. I would work to extend him as soon as possible. You probably need to move on from Baker and from Duke Riley. I think those two alone save you like $17 million in cap space if you cut them. But then you got to figure out a starter to go with David Long. Based on development chances, which were minimal for Channing Tindall, I don't think Fangio is going to suddenly be like, okay, you got the shot. Maybe he proves it, but I think you've got a hedge there. At corner, Jalen Ramsey was damn near perfect when he was in, but I think you need to do more with him, like how the Rams utilized him his final year there. Xavier Howard, as sad as it is for me to say, he's been my favorite player, the last 6-7 years. I think he's a cap casualty, a post-June 1st casualty to basically get the max savings. Kader Kohu in the slot is really good, but not outside. You've got to figure out the depth portion of this. Are you going to bring back Eli Apple, who was okay? He was good at times, bad at times. Are you going to figure out what Cam Smith needs to do to be able to play? I think that was something I expected Miami would investigate more this year, and it didn't happen. You need more in the chamber coming back, than Ethan Bonner, certainly. At safety, you've got to do what you can, I think, to keep Elliott and Holland together. Elliott, another athlete's first guy. Holland, you should break the bank for, relatively speaking, as far as the safety market. Brandon Jones, I think, had a pretty rough year in terms of coverage, was pretty good, especially that Buffalo game at the end of the season in run support. But I think you need to find more versatile depth. And special teams, Miami didn't have a bad year. They were pretty good in kick and punt coverage until the final 2 games of the season. But you had random weird plays like Austin Jackson gets bowled over and you get a field goal blocked against Tennessee. No one talks about that, but that's 3 more points you could have had in that ball game. You lost by 2 or by 1. You had the big kickoff return against the Ravens to start the second half, which kind of squashed your chances. You had basically outplayed Buffalo, and then you give up a punt return for a touchdown. That's enough to warrant Danny Crossman losing his job, and I think that's merciful and a long time coming. They had a great year on special teams, minus the blip in Tennessee, until the last 2 weeks, and that was when you needed all 3 phases to work, and none of them did. I guess the defense did based on what the circumstances were. But defensively, I went through and looked at the losses. The biggest culprit is actually the passing defense, and this was pretty interesting to me. And you can identify the personnel that were missing in each game. So you go back and you look at Josh Allen in that first Bills game, 21 of 25, 320 yards, 4 touchdowns, sacked him twice, but it didn't matter. But you were missing Jalen Phillips and Jalen Ramsey in that ball game. Jalen Hurts, 23 of 31, 279 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, sacked him 3 times. But you had no Jalen Ramsey, no Xavier Howard. The only game you lost where you had all your players was the Kansas City game in Germany, where you actually held Patrick Mahomes to a season-low passing. He was 20 of 30, 185 yards, had 2 touchdowns, and you sacked him twice. But then you get the odd one, the Will Levis game against Tennessee, 23 of 38, 327 yards, a touchdown, a pick, 1 sack. You had no Jalen Phillips, no Jerome Baker. Lamar Jackson, this one hurts. 18 of 21, 321 yards, 5 touchdowns, 1 sack. No Jalen Phillips, no Jerome Baker, and you lost Xavier Howard after the first drive. Josh Allen, 30 of 38, 359 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 picks, 3 sacks. No Jalen Phillips, no Bradley Chubb. You had a limited Jerome Baker who missed the second half, and you had a limited Javon Holland. Mahomes in the playoff game, 23 of 41, 262, 1 touchdown, no interceptions, no sacks. No Jalen Phillips, no Bradley Chubb, no Andrew Van Ginkel, no Jerome Baker, no Xavier Howard, no Javon Holland. So with those games, 158 out of 224 total completions and attempts, 2,053 yards, 17 touchdowns, 4 picks, 12 sacks. So those quarterbacks hit you up for a 71% completion percentage, 293.3 yards a game, 2.4 touchdowns a game, 0.57 interceptions, and 1.71 sacks. So in the losses, pass rush, pass defense, get your personnel better, and I think you've got the makings of an elite defense. It's just a shame you had as many injuries as you did throughout the season because it really derailed you. Now, we've kind of gone through the offense and defense, so let's talk about where the Dolphins go from here. And I think kind of the 6 main points I would want to look at this offseason. The biggest one, the biggest conundrum, is what do you do with Tua Tagovailoa? Like, it certainly sounds like Chris Grier wants that to work out and wants him to be here for the long haul. I think the big question is, do you do that now, and where it's going to look pretty bad optically and you're going to get flamed in the media for doing so after such a terrible end to the season for Tua? Or can you push that down the road a little ways? Can you do some sort of short-term bridge deal? Can you let him play out the fifth-year option and give him the Kirk O'Chains treatment? That's Kirk Cousins, by the way. What do you do there? Number 2, Christian Wilkins. Again, I've been told this is likely to get done in some form or fashion. It's been the same message basically since they didn't get anything accomplished this summer, was that they were close. There was a deal on the table. Chris Grier alluded to that today, and it basically wasn't agreed to. Now, he said Christian Wilkins bet on himself and the agency, which is athletes first. There's some word salad going on there. There's some reading between the lines that you need to do a little bit. The offensive line, number 3. Tron Armstead and Austin Jackson are your only starters under contract coming back. Tron Armstead, I've been told privately, has contemplated retirement as recently as far back as like the middle of this season. Sounded pretty optimistic about wanting to come back and play. Finished the year fairly healthy, given all of his injuries. Connor Williams versus Rob Hunt. I think that's the debate to watch. I think if you're able to get Tua figured out and Wilkins figured out, you're probably only bringing back one of those two guys. Which one is it? And again, I'll reiterate, I think before Connor Williams got hurt, if you were to ask Miami, they would have said Connor Williams is the priority. I think because of that injury, they've kind of shifted their tune a little bit. Now there's the supposed emphasis on more downhill style of running or being able to incorporate that. Where does that leave you? You know, do you need to... Is someone like Rob Jones capable of being the left guard? Does Liam Eichenberg go back to left guard, which is where he started in 2022? Do you bring back Isaiah Wynn? Do you look elsewhere? The offensive line and being able to get more stability and continuity from it. You know, just look at Buffalo. All 5 of their starters played every snap of every game damn near. Like, Miami had, 12 or 13 combinations? I think only the Jets had more. You've got to figure out that piece of it. Point 4, other extensions you need to consider. I think you can push it down the road a little bit with the 2 Jalens. I know Chloe doesn't want to, as you can hear her dismay in the background, but both of those guys being first-round picks, you have fifth-round options available. It might be wise to cash both of those in to extend some other players, primarily looking at, and probably in this order, Javon Holland, David Long, and Deshaun Elliott. Number 5 is the wide receiver position. If you're going to continue with Tua, which it sounds like that is their course, what are you going to do outside of Hill and Waddle? Like, we know those guys are 1A, 1B. Both 1,000-yard guys, you know, over 3,000 total yards, or almost over 3,000 total yards with them. But I think you need someone that has some size and speed to go with them. You know, they tried to be able to do things that they tried to do with the group of Cedric Wilson, Chase Claypool, and River Craycraft. You need someone who can be all those guys into one. And that's going to take a significant investment in terms of draft capital or free agent money or a trade or something. But you've got to have a better option, you know. I don't think you can rely on it just Eric Ezukama coming back and being that guy. And finally, I think your defensive scheme kind of is what it is. I think there's some flexibility to make it better. And that flexibility is, what do you do with Jalen Ramsey? How do you use him? Are you able to find a better running mate to go with David Long that's a little bit more dynamic? Are you able to adequately, find a solution to replace Xavier Howard, whether that's Cam Smith or something else? But I think your scheme is the scheme, and it proved to be largely effective, even through all the onslaught of injuries. And I would argue that, in some of the losses, Philly, the Kansas City game in Germany, Tennessee, the Buffalo finale at home, the defense played well enough to win by and large, and you got let down by dumb errors by the offense and special teams. Tennessee, you had a fumbled snap at the 2-yard line, you had a blocked field goal. Kansas City, you had Tyreek Hill's fumble return for a touchdown. The offense couldn't do anything in the Philadelphia game. Buffalo at home, you got let down by the offense and a punt return for a touchdown. It's there. It's good enough for you to win against these elite teams and elite quarterbacks if you can play complementary football. And I think that's been the thing that has eluded the Dolphins so long as, I guess, really, if we're looking at the timeline, so long as Chris Greer's been the general manager, so long as Tua Tagovailoa's been the quarterback, that complementary, with an E, not an I, by the way, for the many of you who can't use the right version, is what eludes this team the most. They cannot play with all three phases in sync unless it's against bottom feeder teams. So with that in mind, I think your offensive scheme, I've seen the narrative kind of floating around that Miami's got to get more versatile and they've got to be more downhill. They need better, passing concepts that aren't play action based and RPOs. I don't disagree with any of that. But it feels like you're trying to thread an awfully thin needle here when you have all the limitations you have with their order of operations, their pre-snap management with Tua Tagovailoa, his on-field situational awareness and IQ, his arm limitations. You're swinging for the fences here, and I think you have to nail all of those things I listed above in order to give yourself the best roster, because Tua's just not a guy who can lift all the ships on offense when things aren't going 100% the way that they're supposed to based on what you've game planned out. And I guess my closing message to the Dolphins goes back to point one. If you're going to give Tua Tagovailoa an extension, just please be very cautious with it and give yourself an out early in that deal just in case. At some point, he's going to be a finished quarterback product in terms of what he can do physically. Is he really going to grow all that much, above the shoulders from the neck up? Is he going to be a Manning, a Tom Brady, someone like that? No, probably never. You just have to ask yourself at some point, is the juice worth the squeeze, or do you need a new orange? So be cautious. Be very cautious with that. And I think that's one of the things, is having that conversation is what worries me the most, because you have an older owner who wants to win and leave that legacy. You have Chris Greer, who has basically been, let's call it what it is, a coach appeaser. He's not the guy kind of leading those big high-level conversations about the direction of the organization. The coaches don't report to Chris Greer. They work alongside him and report to Mr. Ross. And your CEO is the business guy. Nothing against Tom Garfinkel. He's certainly managed to do some really incredible things with everything that's Dolphins related, and Miami Open and F1 Miami and Rolling Loud and soccer. But none of that plays on the football field on Thursday, Sunday, Monday. Or Saturday sometimes. or Black Friday even. This feels like one of those times where you need, like, not necessarily saying Bill Parcells, but you need someone, that one point of contact who oversees everything football, to kind of speak up and say, hey, this is the direction, here's why, A, B, and C. Not, here's what we're going to do because it's going to help me keep my job, or here's what we're going to do because we can sell tickets and jerseys, or here's what we're going to do because my offense will function great because of this anticipatory stuff, but when we get out of our optimal condition set, it crumbles. That one voice, I think, is what's missing, and I hope it's someone like Brandon Shore. I hope it is, because I feel like this is a very important offseason for the Dolphins. If you're gonna roll through with Tua Tagovailoa again, you gotta hit a lot of notes right on the first try this offseason, or there's gonna be pink slips dished out at the end of next year. So that is my prevailing thought train based on the last month or so of Dolphins football. It was a very fun season up to a point, and when you really had to kind of be businesslike about it, that's when all the media narratives and stuff that all these Dolphins fans love to hate on and rip and, quote on Twitter, that's when all the chickens came home to roost, because Miami couldn't do what the media said they couldn't do all year. So that's the thing. I wonder next year in camp, how much enthusiasm really is there for this team if you run it back, so to speak? Do the wins feel a little less hollow, or a little more hollow, I guess, in September, October, November? And is it just sort of like, okay, great, show me this in December? Because I feel like that's the stance that I want to take. And that Dallas victory on Christmas Eve felt so much more like a relief than a success. And I feel like that's going to be the case next year, where it's like, okay, September, October, November, we know we can do this part. The hard part of the test is still coming up. And if you want to rig the test to be more effective for you, you've got to get home field advantage. So you can't have those games like Kansas City and Tennessee specifically, or Buffalo at the end of the year, where you squander those opportunities in one-score games. To me, this all hinges on McDaniel and Tua and the offensive line. And it's going to be a very interesting offseason to see how they attempt to manufacture and manifest that success change from 2023 to 2024. Thank you guys for listening. I'm sorry the episodes haven't been as frequent this year. We'll have some potential changes coming to the podcast in the coming weeks. I think at this point, with the season done, we'll maybe try to record every 2 weeks and kind of update where we can. We'll talk some draft, we'll talk some combine stuff, free agency, obviously. As I mentioned before, we may have a couple guests and maybe a co-host coming on for several episodes. So we'll see. But thank you for listening. Thank you for following at KevinMD4. Follow the show on Dolphins Talk, iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. 2023 ended with a disappointment. Onward to 24. Fins up.